Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you very much to join this session today. My name is Alexandre Cote and I am the Knowledge Management and Learning Coordinator of the project Bridging the Gap 2. Bridging the Gap 2 is a project funded by the European Union and coordinated by FIAP, the International Ibero-American Foundation for Administration and Public Policies, in partnership with 3 European agencies for development and cooperation, the Spanish, the Italian, and the Austrian. 2 international NGOs, the European Disability Forum and the International Disability and Development Consortium, and 2 observers, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. So, well, as most of you know very well at that point, Bridging the Gap supports the mainstreaming of disability in international cooperation and the efforts of Burkina Faso, Ecuador, Ethiopia, Paraguay, and Sudan in planning and implementing inclusive public policies and services. To support its project partners and target groups through a dedicated knowledge management strategy, Bridging the Gap 2 developed indeed several studies, trainings, and learning spaces at local and in the 5 countries I mentioned, and at global level. I think that among its activities, it's worth highlighting, for example, the preliminary study on the inclusion of persons with disabilities in European Union development cooperation mechanisms, recommendation on the inclusion of migrants with disabilities, the 12 sessions of webinars on disability and development in 3 languages, and several workshops and trainings on disability mainstreaming at global local level. You can find the information related to these activities and all the materials and more on our website and even on the International Disability and Development Consortium website. You find the links here in the chat box. So, well, about today, indeed in line with the activities I mentioned and in the framework of the knowledge management strategy, Bridging the Gap 2 has promoted and funded a study coordinated by Alexandre Cote, together with other 2 experts, Janina Arsenjeva for the studies, for the reports in Ethiopia, Burkina Faso, and Sudan, and Magdalena Orlando for the other reports in South America, in Ecuador and Paraguay. So, this study tried to assess, as you read indeed on the description of the webinar and even in the study published on our website, to assess indeed the understanding of meaningful participation from an organization of persons with disability, as well as governments and donors' perspective in the project partners' countries, but even try to assess to the extent to which the governments create enabling environment for meaningful participation of organizational persons with disabilities in the current practices in terms of participation. But even the contribution of donors and international development agencies in enabling meaningful participation of the organization of persons with disabilities. As I said, you can find this study to learn more on our website. You can download it in PDF on the website, and you find the link here in the chat box. So, well, I would like to say thanks to Alex, the researcher coordinator who is here with us today to present the study results and even to answer to your questions and doubts. And last but not least, before leaving virtually the floor to Alex, I remind you that the session is live captioned and you can follow the transcription by clicking on the link here in the chat box. You find the presentation of this session in your handout on your control panel. So, well, I give you the floor, Alex, so enjoy the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alessia, and thank you to all of you who join us today. So it's a great pleasure to share with you this study. which is entitled the Unsteady Path towards meaningful participation of organization of persons with disabilities. So there is no mystery. We will not keep as a thriller the truth for the end. It's very clear that across the literature review we've done and the study in countries, things are moving. There are efforts made towards participation, but we are not there yet. And this is basically the starting point. But what is really interesting, and the forthcoming global study of the International Disability Alliance is really showing that in recent years there has been really a much greater attention paid towards meaningful participation, or to at least participation of persons with disabilities in policy making, with a big emphasis in international cooperation and development program. They have been through GLAD, through the Bridging the Gap programs, now with the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. There has been quite a lot of emphasis put on the need to consult with organizations of persons with disabilities, and it shows on the field. Things are moving. So the key question we had was, to which extent international cooperation can support and foster meaningful participation of persons with disabilities. So we wanted to assess country situation against the standards set by the CRPD committee in its General Comment 7 on participation of persons with disabilities. But we wanted also to attempt to model a little bit the interaction between national authorities and organizations of persons with disabilities and the broader disability movement. And we'll come back to that. And of course, provide some recommendation on concrete measures that international cooperation can take. So the first question we had is how to consider participation. There are different ways of thinking of participation. The first one is, as it's a human right of persons with disabilities to influence policies and decisions that impact their lives. So participation is an end in itself. However, many actors consider participation as a means to an end, a means to ensure that governments develop the best policies and programs possible with optimum allocation and use of available resources for the realization of all human rights of all persons with disabilities in a given context in compliance with the CRPD. And the take of the study is that it's both. It's an end in itself, no matter what you have to do it, but it's also a means to ensure the best policies and program and use of resource in a given context. And the second one is slightly more demanding, because it means, how do you ensure that people are in position to provide input on the best alternatives that exist for the different or the maximum available resources existing in a given country. And so we looked at participation from those two angles. So first, we made an in-depth reading of the General Comment 7, because when you look at Article 4.3 of the CRPD, it's fairly straightforward. Basically, you have persons with disabilities, you have government, and you have DPOs. And Article 4.3 says that government need to consult persons with disability through their representative organization in any matters that impact their life in the implementation of the CRPD. However, we know that in terms of public participation, and as stipulated in Article 29 of the CRPD, persons with disabilities can, in most countries, participate either by being elected to parliament or elect parliamentarians and different local authorities representatives. But when we go in depth in the GC7, what we see is that the obligation of states towards enabling meaningful participation are fairly developed, and the situation gets complex quite quickly, because every single ministry has the duty to consult with persons with disabilities, and local authorities have the same duty to consult with persons with disabilities. And there is different element of consultation. We have the consultation with regards to implementation, but we have also the consultation with regards to monitoring under Article 33. And we have different players that influence this participation. We have the media, we have the donors that have strong interaction with both authorities and to a lesser extent with DPOs. And then within the person with disabilities and the DPOs, we have subgroups to which the GC7 is paying attention, such as children with disabilities and parents groups, women with disabilities, most marginalized groups. And then those organizations of people with disability in the GC7 are clearly given the priority over different type of organization that would be organization for persons with disabilities, which we will call here service providers. And the GC7 pay attention to this element. And there is finally the national umbrella, which the GC7 promotes, which should be the counterpart to actually the Article 33 coordination body in terms of cross-ministerial coordination and consultation with DPOs. So for those of you who can see the screen, we have a picture that is fairly complex, and there is a lot of moving parts in this aspect of meaningful participation. And when doing the study at the country level, we could see that there can be issues at any of those different bubbles and arrows between all those different actors and levels. So a core element that we want to highlight, and that has been a bit of foundation for the study, is that meaningful participation and public participation in general is not technocratic. It's politics. It's politics from a civil society state point of view, but it's also politics within civil society and within state apparatus and public authorities. And the GC7 has a very normative perspective, because that's what the CRPD committee, like any other treaty body, is supposed to do. They don't do political economy analysis. They are setting norms. And they have elaborated the obligation of states in a fairly expansive manner. And it includes regulatory framework, institutional mechanism, financial support, technical assistance to organization of persons with disabilities, but also some kind of encouragement of outreach to different groups to ensure that everybody is involved. And there is a core assumption in the GC7 is that those obligations have to be implemented in good faith, with transparency, mutual respect, and meaningful dialogue to guarantee the independence and autonomy of organization of persons with disabilities. And it's clear that when you look at the set of obligations, which include, as I mentioned, regulatory issues, financial supports, and others, if this is not implemented with the goal, the genuine goal to support independence and autonomy of DPOs and meaningful participation, it can turn fairly quickly into strong co-optation from the government towards civil society, here the organization of persons with disabilities. And just to be clear, when we say co-optation, it doesn't mean evil, Machiavellic politics. You know, it's just sometimes it's just a matter of fact. It doesn't have to be the design behind it. It might be the end result. So it's very important when looking at the obligation of GC7 to consider that anything that is about public participation is also about politics and about the political economy of a given context. And one key element that we saw across the literature is that meaningful participation and public participation is a co-production between stakeholders. It's not just the government, of course, has to create the enabling environment for participation, but civil society is not just an object of participation. Both the state and organization of persons with disabilities, in this case, will adopt strategies and tactics in relation to one another. And in some contexts, there will be significant impact from other actors, such as service provider or international development agencies, NGOs. And it's very important also to acknowledge that both from the government side, but also to some extent from the civil society side, participation can be used to legitimize existing policies and processes and preserve an existing status quo, which may perpetuate inequalities. It would be the case, for instance, if as a government, I choose to consult only with certain groups of persons with disabilities who already have, let's say, for instance, social protection benefits, and I would not include other groups who are not yet covered by such programs. And I still can say that, yes, there was participation, but I didn't do it in a way that would challenge the existing status quo. So this is a very important element that has guided the way we looked at the meaningful participation. Another element, before we move to the detail of the study, is that in general, are we living and are we working in enabling environment for public participation? So I project on the screen the map, the world map of Civicus, civil society monitoring, or civic space monitoring, which basically categorize countries along 5 levels, where the civic space for engagement is closed, repressed, obstruct, narrowed, and open. Open is plain green, and there are very few countries in the world, rich, middle income, or low income, that are open. The vast majority of countries are either narrowed, obstructed, repressed, and we have more than a few that are closed. So this is something that is very important. Understanding meaningful participation of DPOs cannot be isolated from the overall context in terms of public participation in general. Interestingly enough, and we will see, there is no direct connection between the level of participation of organization of persons with disabilities and the extent of which the public participation is closed. What will be alterated might be the quality, but it seems that in some contexts, it might be easier for organization of persons with disability to actually engage with government than other branch of civil society that might be more politically sensitive, for instance. So if we look at the 5 countries that are part of Bridge the Gap and were part of the study, they have, none of them is open, and at the least, the civic space for public participation is narrowed, and in the case of Sudan, considered as closed. If we look at other indicators like the World Bank Governance, Voice and Accountability Index, basically most of the countries except Burkina Faso are below the regional average. They are regional average and are not considered as very high in terms of voice and accountability in the index. But as I mentioned earlier, interestingly enough, while, for instance, we see that Sudan is closed, it's also a country where organizations of persons with disabilities have done a submission to the CRPD committee review in writing, while, for instance, Ecuador, in the initial round of review, while it's the one who has the best indicator in terms of the civic space monitor, there was no contribution to the CRPD committee. So as I mentioned, this overall environment create a space, create a set of conditions, but there is no fatalistic determination with regards to how this impacts directly the participation of persons with disabilities. So what we did, we basically, to assess the enabling environment and efforts made towards meaningful participation, we identified 10 key elements, which we tried to categorize across 6 levels, which have been color-coded. So we have 3 shades of orange, yellow-orange, from clearer to darker, and we have 3 shades of green from clearer to darker. So when any element is categorized in the yellow or an orange category, it means it didn't pass. What exists is has not passed the threshold that would contribute effectively to meaningful participation. When it's green, it passed this threshold. It means that there is a kind of critical level that has been reached, which actually can contribute to meaningful participation. And the 10 elements were first, the willingness to engage. For meaningful participation to exist, you need a willingness to engage from the government side and the DPO side, of course. And what we were trying to assess here is to which extent persons with disabilities are considered a key stakeholder. The second thing is meaningful participation means there is something to discuss. There is no policy in place, no plans to do so, it's very hard to have meaningful consultation because there is no object for this consultation. So that's also an element that we took into consideration. The third one is the existence of consultation mechanism. And here we looked at the legal standing, the composition, the perceived impact, the representativeness, etc., etc. Transparency, to which extent there is accessibility to information, procedures and processes that are framing meaningful participation, are they transparent to all players? And to which extent there is access to data that allow for meaningful participation. Then we looked at the perception from the DPOs of their level of participation, but also what the government is thinking in terms of what is the level of participation. So we took a very standard scale: inform, consult, involve, collaborate, and co-decision. Then the level of support that is provided by the government and public authorities to organizations of persons with disabilities, which could be in ease of registration, funding, training, or in-kind support, for instance, offices, secondary staff, etc. Then to which extent this participation is seeking inclusion of all. And it can be the different groups of persons with disabilities, age, like for instance, children, the issue of gender and women with disabilities, but also the location. Is participation centralized at the capital level, or is there an attempt to have representation from remote areas, for instance? Then we had an all-in-one, I would say, because this was not the object per se of the study, to look at the disability movement engagement along different lines. To which extent the disability movement perceives itself as independent? What are the priorities of the movement? The level of inclusiveness in the movement in terms of groups of persons with disability, women with disability, location, but also the level of cohesion. To which extent are we in a space that is, there is competition between actors within the movement, or at the opposite, is there mutual reinforcement and cohesion? And the last two are basically the extent to which international cooperation actors support organization of persons with disabilities and support the dialogue. So to be able to rank or to attribute a level to those different elements, we carried 3 country missions in Paraguay, Ecuador, and Ethiopia. We could not carry mission in Burkina Faso and Sudan, unfortunately, due to security reasons, but there was a set of interview and exchange at distance. So it's very important that whatever we say from now in terms of assessment needs to be, especially for Sudan and Burkina Faso, is really conditional, because we had much less information than for Ecuador, Ethiopia, and Paraguay. So that's important to take into consideration. And we try to meet DPOs, individual activists, service providers, civil society, government, and international cooperation actors. So looking now at the matrix, we have on the left side the 10 elements, and then we have the 5 countries, and for each element and in each countries we attribute a color. So unsurprisingly, we see much more yellow and orange than we see green. And this is what I said at the beginning, is that while there is movements towards participation, there are very few elements of required for meaningful participation where a threshold has been passed towards really genuine participation. The first one, willingness to engage, we had clearly in all countries, persons with disabilities are identified as stakeholders. It doesn't say anything about the quality of consultation and the extent of consultation, but there is the willingness to engage from the government side, including in many cases at local level. We didn't dive into local level because we didn't have the time, but we had feedback from stakeholders in that direction. So there is willingness to engage. In terms of development of policies, it was quite clear that in most countries, except Ecuador, the level of development of policies for persons with disabilities is fairly low if we compare to other environments and countries, which restrict quite a lot the space and the opportunities and the object for consultation. We are still in a phase in countries where DPOs are trying to build the momentum towards getting something to discuss with the government, rather than having a set of policies on which there is clearly element to be discussed. In terms of consultation mechanism, clearly in Latin America, there are, as in many countries of the region, you have quite strong consultation mechanism. However, they have a stronger legal standing, they have a stronger level of resources. There are issues with regards to membership, there are issues with regards to impact and perceived impact, for instance, to which extent those mechanisms really have impact on the cross ministerial or cross-governmental discussion and debates. If we look in Sudan and Burkina Faso, some mechanisms have been put in place which are for the moment kind of emerging and not perceived as really like efficient. And in Ethiopia, there was mention of mechanism, but there was no clear evidence of ongoing functioning. With regards to transparency, this is an issue in most countries, and none of them passed the threshold. A lot of debate, a lot of issues with regards to availability of data, accessibility of data, and the fact that procedures and processes are transparent for some people and organizations, but not for all. And there are some insiders and there are outsiders within the movement. So there is not a level playing field with regards to access to those information. Level of participation, the same. Most of the feedback we got was we are informed, we are consulted, but most of the time we don't have the feeling it makes much difference. So this difference between I have a chance to talk, I am listened and I can influence, this was not completely, this did not come across very strong. In terms of support to DPOs, it's quite weak in most countries. Ecuador has a quite strong support to DPOs, which may comes, as we will see later, with some also limitation. And in other countries, there is very low level of public funding for DPOs. There might be issues in some countries where service providers might get more support because they may be in better position or with better organization to manage funds, etc. In terms of inclusion efforts, it's not enough efforts are made across countries, especially with most marginalized groups of persons with disabilities. In some countries, women with disabilities have been more engaged than others, but then in exchange, there is lack of representation from remote areas. And in all countries, there is little effort to ensure representation and participation of children themselves. With regards to the disability movement engagement, in most countries, there are challenges in terms of cohesion. There are challenges in terms of maturity of the movement and inclusiveness in the movement. From those 5 countries, it seemed to be that the Ethiopian Federation of Disabled People was probably the one who had succeeded to have the most stable and inclusive, to a certain extent, constituency and being able to channel some of the grievance or key demands towards government. But we will see that because of the specific situation of Ethiopia in the past decade, which has changed recently, this capacity of the disability movement does not always translate in actually meaningful participation. In terms of international cooperation, we got positive feedback in Burkina Faso and Ethiopia of quite strong support to DPOs. Less so in Sudan and Ecuador and Paraguay, but with the idea that it was there in the past and there was some phasing out more or less few years ago, and there was a request from, we will come back to this point in the recommendation, a request from the DPOs to have the more support from international cooperation. In terms of the support of international cooperation to dialogue, there are countries like Burkina Faso, Sudan, or Paraguay where international cooperation explicitly supports the consultation mechanism and the engagement mechanisms, while in the 2 other countries we've seen that didn't come across. So on the basis of this on this matrix and other elements, we try basically to map and model the different type of interaction between state and the disability movement by combining state engagement and disability movement engagement. So on the screen, I project the matrix, which goes from low to high state engagement and low to high disability movement engagement. If you are low, you are non-participation. And if you have high disability movement engagement and high state engagement, you have meaningful participation. The yellow boxes characterize the zone where there is no participation, or let's say not yet participation. And the green ones is where we are in the participation zone, if I may say. And we have in the middle two levels that are quite close one to another, one that we will call quasi-participation and one that we will call basic participation. Quasi-participation would be when there is a mechanism, DPOs are invited, but there is no influence. There is no, it's like there is participation, but actually in process to some extent, but there is no effect or very little. Basic participation is when you cross the line, where those mechanisms start to produce effects. And meaningful participation, it's when there is inclusiveness, there is high level of influence, which doesn't mean that DPOs always get what they want, but at least there is in-depth dialogue and there is justification for not taking or, let's say, dealing with the recommendations that have been made in a different ways. So there is an accountability mechanism and feedback loop that are taking place. And what we have identified is there is different paths. How do you move from low or non-participation to meaningful participation? And you can have a state-driven path, which start often with tokenism, where you would have, for instance, yes, meeting with the DPO once a year for the 3rd of December, and nothing much, but photos are taken, and it goes to the newspaper, etc. Extension, it's basically when the DPOs are considered as an extension of the government, and the government will, for instance, channel fund, and say to the DPOs, okay, you will do that. The DPOs in that case have little structuration and little identity, and basically complement the government, but from a government drive. And the last one is co-optation. It's basically there is an identity within the DPOs, there is a movement, but the drive and the main direction of this movement are actually guided by the government. And it can happen, for instance, if the government is providing the support, the money, the staff, etc., leaving actually little room for autonomy of DPOs. And there is, on the other hand, a DPO driven path, which would be countries where government might not be as responsive for a reason or another. And you have 3 different levels. You would have emergence, where basically the disability movement start to exist and bubbled. Substitution, which is when the government, for instance, is not delivering services and the civic space is fairly closed. So advocacy is not an option. So basically DPOs turn to service provision, and they do it instead of the government with no support. And the last one is complementarity, is when basically there is discussion with government, there are exchange, and it's the other side of the coin of co-optation. It's basically DPOs are doing things and government might support to some extent, but there is no real dialogue about it. And then if we cross the line from quasi-participation to participation, we identify 2 levels. Invited participation is basically, yes, there is dialogue, but it's at the invitation of the government. and the claim participation, which is DPOs basically crashing the party and saying, we want a seat at the table. And they do. And they get their seat at the table. This would be, for instance, the type of things that we might see in SDG-related movement or anti-poverty commission, where basically DPOs will force themselves in and be supported sometimes by different actors to do so, and then will hold the line and keep this element. So we have tried to position countries in this map. As I said, it's really tentatively because we do not have all the data we require. But there was, through the different feedback, we could see some of the difference with, in Latin America, the path towards meaningful participation being quite state-driven, with more policies in place, stronger mechanism in place, which did not mean more autonomy in the disability movement. And there was level of cooptation and level of extension that could be seen. In the other side, in Ethiopia, there was quite clearly, due to the limitation in terms of possibility for advocacy under the former regime, there was clearly a path where there was substitution and moving towards complementarity. But in the same time, there are dialogue with the government. There are things happening which position Ethiopia at this level. And from the few elements we got from Sudan and Burkina Faso, we could feel that there was this quasi-participation. Mechanisms are getting in place, but the disability movement itself is not that well structured. And on the side of the government, the interaction between ministries might not work as well. And there is little connection between the national coordination mechanism and those different ministries. So it looks like there is participation, but actually it's not getting much traction. So I would pause at this moment to see if there is any questions with regards to this first level of analysis before we move to the recommendation. So you can raise your hand or.
Thank you very much, Alex. And yes, exactly. Now, if you want to make some questions, you can virtually raise your hand, and I will try to give you to open your mic. We are a lot of attendees, so I hope that the platform will work, but I will try indeed. But if not, you can absolutely write your question in the chat box. We already have, Alex, some question. I will just make a test, try, because I see even some raised hands, and I will try to give the floor to Jimmy Hinks. I open your mic now.
Thanks, Alicia. Thanks, Alex, for the very detailed presentation. When I first read this report, it struck me how good it is. And for me, I love the slide of the graph with the low, medium, high state engagement and disability movement engagement. That to me sums up everything you've talked through over the last 45 minutes or so in one place. And thank you for that. I just wanted to make a question and a point that where we're looking down the low end of the scale of non-participation, tokenism and emergence, the fact that states are further through the continuum towards the quasi and basic participation doesn't mean that tokenism doesn't happen and non-participation doesn't happen. Even a state or an organization which is in a position where it's ensuring strong, meaningful participation is still in danger of tokenism and non-participation from time to time. So I just wanted to point that out and to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. And this is, I cannot tell you the number of hours we spend trying to put the bubbles, the country bubbles in the map. And because it's first, everything is relative, there is no absolute. And in a given country at a given time, you can have processes that would be in quasi-participation, processes that will be pure tokenism. So definitely, it's not like it's not like the bubble is placed and then it encompasses everything. It's not, definitely. What we try to do is basically the general overview, the general perception of players. But it would be, for instance, interesting to use such a mapping for the ongoing processes in the same country. And I'm pretty sure you would have different, you would be able to place the cursor at different level. I just saw different questions that I can answer in the chat box that I can answer quite quickly. The first one is, do we use OPD or DPO? We should be using OPD from what I have been seeing lately. I have been 25 years into this, so I'm still stuck with DPOs, but yeah, we should be using OPDs. Under willingness to engage, so Jevis asked the question, under willingness to engage, basically how do we measure this? And this is a very important point for all those criteria, which I wanted to say, is that we developed those elements and the scale based on the literature existing, but we didn't have the time nor the resource to go in a very scientific classification and scoring system. So what we did is basically we gathered all the perception of the different players. So we didn't take only what the DPOs were saying, but in the countries we had different stakeholders' perspective. We first gathered all the perspective of the stakeholders before we made a first grading, so to say, of the different elements. But then once we have done all the countries, we did it again, because we did a relative grading. Nothing is absolute, and that is important. And this is probably for the coming months and next year, one of the things that we would like to do is basically deepen and work more on furthering and how to say, transforming this initial attempt into a more scientifically defined classification and categorization level. Is there any question?
I saw that there is a couple of raised hands. I would like to give the floor to our friend from IFO, Michele Falavigna. I open your mic now. Thank you.
Hi, Alex and Alessia. Thank you very much and congratulations for the presentation. My question is about if doing the study you came across development cooperation partners that actually have within their staff dealing with civil society organization, they have person with disabilities, because going around many countries, I found that very few development cooperation partners that deals with disability do hire person with disabilities within their staff. That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I would not be able to give you information on this. From, I think, except in one country where one of the bilaterals had a staff with disability, I didn't hear anything else. But I would not guarantee that this is the case. That's just the information we had. Anybody else?
Yes, I will now open the mic to Benedict van den Boom. I saw that you raised your hand. I open the mic. Sorry.
Thank you, Alessia, and thank you so much for this highly interesting presentation. I would have one question that might already go into recommendations, and I know that they are coming later, but to what extent is there a relationship between meaningful participation or openness to the disability movement and to civil society at large? Or put differently, to what extent would opening the civil space or creating a favorable civic space also automatically benefit ODPs? Apologies.
I would be really interesting. I am focusing a lot lately on social protection. This is the work I do. But I have to say that I would love to have more time to investigate. I think the global survey that is coming from IDA will give us more elements along those lines. It's basically to which extent there is a correlation between open civic space or more open civic space and DPO participation. From what we've seen in those countries and from the literature and exchange with others, I think that the level of maturity of the disability movement play a very big role. And countries' civic space modify over decades. And those two, and I think this is why we insisted on this co-production between the two. But what we see also is that you cannot have one without another. If you want meaningful participation, you cannot have meaningful participation in a closed space, because there will be a limit to accountability, there will be a limit to access of information. In the other hand, it's not because you have great access to information that you will obviously have meaningful participation. I give the example of India. India is one of the countries with the Right to Information Act. You can have a lot of information, much more than in many, many other countries. But the way the disability movement is structured, in big part because India is gigantic and create a lot of challenge for coordination of the movement, it doesn't give the opportunity of the movement to really leverage this access to information. So I think it would be interesting to go in depth. I don't have a clear, straightforward answer to that for the moment.
Well, Alex, I have other couple of raised hands. If you want, we can go ahead with a couple of questions more, or if you...
I think we can take two more questions, but maybe in a row, and then we will move to the...
Okay, great. So I open the mic to Patience Dalla. I would be able... Sorry, I'm not able to open your mic. I will try then with Sylvie Cordier. Okay, your mic is open. Thank you.
Hi, Alex, and thank you for that very interesting presentation. I'm looking forward to diving in the report if I can understand it. So my question was about the last diagram, the last slide, and I'm just curious to know if you're aware of any low or middle income countries where the disability movement has successfully reached the claim participation stage, and if in that case the disability movement is only strictly represented by OPDs, or do we have individuals who also have a very strong role there? It just hasn't thought about a potential model of what is success and what does it mean, or how do we get there? Thanks.
So, to the best of my knowledge, because there are a lot of countries in the world, and I know just a little bit of them. One of the country I have been working lately where I have been quite surprised by the quality of participation is Fiji. Fiji in the last 2 years, Fiji has a long time existing disability movement that has structured over the years with a political environment that is not the easiest one. But I would say in the last 2 years, the quality of participation between government and civil society has been quite astonishing. I would have a hard time putting it's not meaningful participation yet because I don't think it's as cross-sectoral as it should be. And I think some groups have less access than others, but it's more inclusive than many. So I would say, but it's a window of opportunity. If a certain government, it's just after the ratification of the CRPD, and I think this is, if we go back to the point that our colleagues was making earlier, in a given point of time, you would have different level of participation in different processes, and the quality of participation can change dramatically with the different government or different momentum that are taking place in countries. But I would say it would be hard to find. I never heard about any country where I would say meaningful participation has been achieved, because you would have either constraints at the level of access to information, constraints at the level of coordination and impact on ministries, on sectoral policies, or you would have limitation at the level of the disability movement itself and the level of inclusiveness. But I think we can find countries today that are on the outer line of meaningful participation, basically invited participation, basic participation, and claimed participation. Just one question that was asked about the representativeness of the interviews. And this is very important. We are not claiming that this is not an evaluation and scientific research or anything like that. It's a preliminary study that was done with limited resources. And the main focus was basically building the models, building the elements, building this model. And as we will see now, the recommendation were first and foremost for international cooperation actors. But it would be interesting, and I am exchanging with a PhD students right now to see how we can use this model and develop it further with much more in-depth analysis and interviews and quality work. So it's very important to put the caveat on the level of representativeness of the different stakeholders. I would say that at the level of DPOs, we are quite clear that at least for national level, we achieved quite good representation. With other stakeholders, it's very variable, and that's an important point.
Thank you very much, Alex. I would suggest to go ahead, and I will ask people raise their hands to keep it raised, and we will try to give you the floor later. Okay? Thank you very much.
So as we mentioned, we are in different countries. The impulse towards participation and engagement can be state-driven, which means government is actually the one pulling the disability movement for a reason or another. It can be DPO-driven. It's basically the DPOs that are pushing and trying to open doors and get involved. Very rarely you would have a spontaneously balanced dynamic between government and state and DPOs, but I would say it's the case for any civil society movement and public participation. So looking at the recommendation, as I mentioned, we've really focused on what international cooperation actors can do. And the first one, which probably is the easiest to do and might not be the most costly, is basically leveling the playing fields in terms of data and information. How do we ensure that actors within the disability movement and within the government have more or less the same level of information and quality of information? So, for instance, data. Working with the national statistical offices to do disaggregation of census, household surveys, using geographic information system, reflecting those data, making them usable and user-friendly is actually something that matters a lot. So for instance, this week, tomorrow, we have a webinar with Indian DPOs, and what we did is basically take the census data, take the data from the administrative data in terms of disability pension, and building basically coverage and adequacy assessment for all states in India. All this data is public. It's just you need somebody to crunch the numbers and present this information in a way that can be useful for DPOs. And I think it's there is not enough effort that is going into that. Many countries in the last wave of census and household surveys have been using the Washington group, for instance, but there has been still to date, it's coming and there is more and more, but still few effort have been made to build reports on this, and reports that are understandable by DPOs. Reports that will look, for instance, on interaction between gender and disability, and trying to use disaggregation to assess to which extent women with disability face inequalities more from a disability aspect or more from a gender inequality aspect, etc., etc. This doesn't cost much money to do, and it can have a very high added value. So that's one element. But the other type of data, it's basically about what's going on. And this is something that is really important. People don't always know what's going on. Another element on which we have been working for a while, but still didn't gain much traction, it's basically CRPD compliant public budget analysis. Looking at government spending from a CRPD perspective and putting the numbers out there. It helps a lot. Because, for instance, in some disability movements, you would have insiders that have access to funds because they have privileged connection with governments. And people kind of know it and they don't know it, and it raises suspicion and it fuels the kind of bad blood that may exist in some disability movement. Once the data are available, and if there is a process of joint budget analysis, then it takes away kind of the suspicion. Things are there. Now they are facts. They are not rumors. And then we can work on it. Existing mapping, existing services mapping. What is already there? What are the groups who benefit from services? What are the groups who today doesn't have services? If we want meaningful participation and we want to ensure that no one is left behind, it's very important to know what exists. And if you look at data, statistical data, budget, and service mapping, it gives you a quite clear idea of who got something and who got nothing, and where you should put priorities in the future. And it helps also within the disability movement to make space for groups that so far didn't have really space. As I mentioned, very often, again, insiders would know that there is a World Bank program with the Ministry of Justice, and the others would not. So making sure that this type of information is in plain language and is available to most of all, it could contribute a lot to meaningful participation, at least from a civil society side in leveling the playing field. But it would be the case also for many local authorities who often are not aware of many of those issues. And the same goes for international programs. And of course, the whole idea is whatever data you are working on, how do you make sure that they are available in accessible format from different stakeholders? And that, again, doesn't cost much money. I'm not saying it's free of charge, of course it's not, but it's probably one of the most feasible thing to do that can be fairly neutral and that can have a quite big impact on the enabling environment for meaningful participation. The question of transparency and access to information was one of the biggest, most recurring elements coming from the different stakeholders. The second recommendation, and this is very basic, I would say, it's modeling. It's basically how, as an international cooperation actor, I can show what does it look like, meaningful participation. And one of the recommendations we make whether for EU delegation, UN resident coordinators. It's basically to conduct annual consultation meetings. DPOs, and one very important point from DPOs is that engaging in a process has an opportunity cost, because I have free staff. So if I go to that meeting, I don't go to this meeting. If I engage in this project, I cannot engage in that project. I don't have enough human resource to do so. And if I have to run after the information, if I have to do all that, basically I'm exhausting myself, and I may not make the good choice. I may actually put a lot of emphasis on a process that will yield very low influence and results, while other processes could have been much more beneficial. So one of proposition we make would be, why not having every year the EU and the different EU member states having a joint one day and a half meeting with the DPOs and say, okay, those are the programs that took place this year. Those are the things we want to do next year. Those are the big ticket items, budget support, reform of healthcare sector, education, and having an exchange with DPOs and trying to identify what could be the window of opportunity for participation. And of course, it's not just putting everybody in a room and doing it. Of course, they would need to have preparation with DPOs, to have preliminary information, especially with regards to most marginalized groups. We might not always be in the best position to come in those meetings and be in the best level of information. But we believe that if those kind of meetings were taking place annually, it would give a panoptic view to DPOs and would increase their ability to make strategic choices. Okay, this is everything that's going to happen. From everything I know, I think that those two processes are the ones that are the most important, the one that we cannot miss. Others are important too, but those are the ones. But they need this panoptic view to be able to make those decisions. And what we have seen, unfortunately, is that while many NGOs or donors want to engage in meaningful participation because they say, oh, I have to do it, they are kind of pulling. And DPOs, yeah, of course, I want to engage in this process. Thank you. Yes, let's do it. But the actor doing that doesn't always think of the opportunity cost it represents for the DPO. And maybe actually the DPO would have been better off going in another process, but the other process was not as open. And I think there is how the UN resident coordinator, the EU delegation can play a role, a kind of convening role with their different constituencies of actors to provide those kind of overview to DPOs. The second recommendation is basically to involve organization of persons with disabilities in major mainstream programs. Not only the disability program, but the major mainstream program, the big ticket item. And to help them being meaningful counterpart and players in those. And at the very least, even if a major program is finishing, and you didn't involve DPOs in it from the beginning, involve them in evaluation. Program evaluation for major public policy or major programs or budget support provide a tremendous level of information. It will help DPOs understanding for the next time around what's important, what's an indicators, how they are used, why should I have been part of this conversation that happened last week at the very beginning of a program, and I will understand much better those things. So in terms of capacity building, in terms also of awareness raising of many players, having DPOs and OPDs present and involved in evaluation can have a tremendous impact and would create a culture, would help DPOs to get engaged more at the design level the next time around. Of course, as I said, I mentioned opportunity cost. It's critical. If you want meaningful participation, there is need for core funding of the organization of people with disability at national and local level. As I mentioned, some donors do it, very few. Very often it's project funded with activities, etc. And I don't think that there is always enough assessment of opportunity cost that it represents for DPOs. Not every money is good money, not every project is the best use of existing resources within the disability movement to foster overall inclusion. And that, I think, is an important element. And as what came very strongly from the organization from the 5 countries is that, yes, we want government money to be able to do our job because it's sustainable and it's here, but we need balance. We need donors' money to keep our autonomy and independence. It helps us to have this money. So it's not only about functioning, it's about the balance towards independence and autonomy. With regards to the bigger player, those who have called for proposal, basically the recommendation recall that equality is not treating everybody the same, but providing equal opportunities. Very often you would have EU or World Bank or other players having called for proposal, and the type of support available is the same to everybody to apply, which very often is quite minimum. But we know that many DPOs are not in position. They don't have the same projects writing capacity, which doesn't mean they don't have good ideas, which doesn't mean that they don't have actual outreach in the field. It's just their capacity of formulation is not the same. So we are calling for some kind of earmarking support. You are doing a call for proposal. You want most marginalized groups to be paid attention to. You need to earmark a certain number of grants for those marginalized groups, including persons with disabilities, and you need to support those people and organizations to apply. And it's not discrimination against other players, it's affirmative action. It's basically equalization of opportunities. And we think that more can be done in that side. And there is many more recommendations with regards to what DPO need. How do you support consensus building among the DPOs? How do you support national level and local level exchange and coordination, etc.? And very importantly, how do you support inclusion of the most marginalized groups and women with disabilities? When it comes to support to dialogue, one of the big feedback we got in this study, but also in other work we are doing, is basically, yes, training DPOs is important, but please train government staff too. And we had an experience with the Pacific Disability Forum and the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat a few weeks ago in February, before COVID-19 stopped us doing all those things. We had 1 week training with disability government focal points from 10 countries of the Pacific and the national DPOs together on CRPD compliant public policy. And it was amazing. The quality of exchange between government focal point, between DPOs and government focal point, between DPOs themselves, really, and there was a hunger. There was a hunger for knowledge, for exchange, both from government level and for DPOs, because with this sense that, yes, we agreed to do all those things, how do we do that? So there is really the need to invest in capacity development of government staff in terms of CRPD so that they speak the same language than DPOs. And there is not this permanent gap in the type of conversation and starting point. Supporting and valuing dialogue and involvement of organization of persons with disability in any program that is designed and implemented with government. Investing and supporting national and local coordination mechanism. Here I mention, I reference to disability coordination mechanism. It could be investing in it, but it could be also, oh, we have a major program in access to justice. We want the opinion of the National Council. We want an opinion of the National Coordination Mechanism, and we will ask the Ministry of Justice to organize it via the mechanism. How do you basically put other sectoral ministry, not only the Ministry of Social Affairs, but other sectoral ministry, how do you value towards them and in their eyes this national coordination mechanism so that they pay more attention and send more senior people attending? Supporting and collective and evidence-based general sectoral gap analysis, national disability inclusion action plan, working on planning together, as we mentioned at the very first point with the data, analyzing the data together with DPOs and government can really foster a kind of more neutral base for discussion. It's not you say, I say, it's not your opinion, my opinion. It's basically, let's try to look at the evidence and what do we learn from that. And let's try to look at the resource and what do we learn from that. And one of the elements also is remembering that when you support the government to do its CRPD parallel report, the CRPD report, and the DPOs doing its parallel report, you are supporting a dialogue. It's a dialogue that will be mediated by the CRPD committee at certain point, but it's a dialogue. And we have seen that in many countries. It's a good investment, supporting both government and DPOs, doing their own things, their own reporting, contributing to one another, especially DPOs towards the state one. It's something that can really contribute to support dialogue and participation. And to conclude before the next round of question, I think that the best quote we had from a public official came from Paraguay, which says the disability sector is the only one. It's not for women, not for indigenous person, for which the law compels the ministers, the vice ministers, to sit at the table, but we haven't yet taken advantage of this situation to have an impact and to transform. And this is very clear. In many countries, even those who have a closed space, if you have ratified the CRPD, at some point, you will create a national coordination mechanism because it's a legal obligation and you will do it. And you might have a certain level of seniority in terms of public official that will take part. There is a sense in the countries where we've done this assessment that this opportunity has not been seized already, and we didn't make the most out of it. And that's why we refer to this unsteady path towards meaningful participation. So I would stop there and look forward to the exchange and the questions.
Thank you very much, Alex. Indeed, we have a few questions. I will leave you the question written in the chat box. In the meantime, I will try to open the floor to the hands raised are a lot, so I suggest to keep your intervention short. So I will give the floor, sorry, I will give the floor, I will try to open the mic to Paula Earn. Yes, your mic is open. Thank you.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. This is Paula Hearn from the International Disability Alliance. Thank you so much for this presentation and for this great analysis that's focusing so specifically, and to have these case studies that are context driven within the countries. So as you mentioned a few times, Alex, thank you for plugging that IDA is in the process of finalizing our global survey, which is the perception survey from OPDs around participation, development programs, and policies. So it was really fascinating to see how this will align and complement, hopefully, around what you've presented from a perception of OPDs and how they're perceiving participation within their interactions with both governments, the United Nations, different departments, and also within donor environments as well. Just to allude to a comment made earlier around the idea of looking at open participation and context, we hope to aim to do this within our final consolidated report that will be coming out hopefully within the coming weeks, to look at the context as much as possible, although it is a global survey around but it'll give us some insights around this. We hope to look a bit closer around areas of participation. You know, what departments are open around participating, who's participating, who's not participating, what are those barriers that are coming, what are the mechanisms and the conditions for participating, and also the quality of participation and the outcomes that are happening. And hopefully we're just finalizing some of the recommendations and putting out some of the good practices that have come from our analysis. So this was really helpful to hear sort of the recommendations that you've just mapped out around for international cooperation. So thank you for that and for this piece. So congratulations on this study, and thank you very much for providing sort of a deeper dive into these specific countries and their contexts. And it really shows how diverse everything can be and what really plays into this larger picture. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Alex, I will take another question. I will open the mic to Katarina Fortner. Sorry for the pronunciation. Yeah, your mic is open. Thank you.
Yeah, hello. This is Katarina Fortner. I'm working as an inclusive education advisor for CBM in Latin America. My question is, you talk about OPDs like if this would be an institution or a fixed group or something, and what I see from my work visiting so many different countries is that OPDs are very, very different. So there are, for instance, in Honduras, there are OPDs which only represent a few people, and I have seen in countries like Guatemala, OPDs which are only situated in the capital city and are not represented in the countryside. And we have been, for CBM, we have been supporting CBID, community-based inclusive development programs, which are supporting the OPD foundation or representation of people in smaller cities or in the countryside. I think this structure is very important to your presentation about the participation and the influence people people with disabilities have in their organizations and from their organizations towards the government and towards impact, because I think this impact thing is so important. This has to happen in the whole country and not only in the capital city where these organizations are represented. So my question is, have you taken this into account? I know CBM, for instance, has been working around this subject in Ecuador and I guess also in Ethiopia. So my interest is to see if you have taken into account some kind of the representativeness of OPDs in the whole country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Alex, if you want to reply, and maybe. Okay.
This is a very important point. As I mentioned, the study did not do two things, among many others. It didn't look at the dynamic between national and local, because we tried. It was in the initial plan that we had too many constraints in terms of the time and moving along in countries. And the second one is we didn't evaluate the movement per se. This was not the object of the object was the interaction between the disability movement and the government. There are issues of representativeness of the disability movement in all countries in the world. Very few countries would have a real geographic representation from a national movement to a local movement everywhere in the country. Actually, there are significant gaps in many countries. That's for sure. And this is definitely, when I mentioned, I went fast on this, but in the recommendation, this is really one of the recommendations we do, is that there should be much more investment in supporting both the emergence of DPOs, OPDs at local level, but also the exchange and the coordination between national level and local level. Let's just give me the opportunity to share one example about budget. National advocacy is critical because public budgets are adopted at national level in most countries. But then money is spent at the local level. If you have only the national budget advocacy, you will never know. You will never know what's going on with this money. You need the DPO at the national level, at the local level, to be able to say this money never arrived. But DPOs at the local level need to have people at the national level first to get the information that money is supposed to arrive, but also to be able to do something about it later on. So there is a mutually reinforcing interest of having strong local disability movement and strong national disability movement. The problem, and it takes a lot of resources to develop that. And let's to put some challenge, more challenge along those lines. I think it's important to highlight two elements. The first one is decentralization, which is growing in many countries, like for instance Nepal recently, where you have province taking a lot of responsibilities, which create one more layer between community and states. You have this province or state level or region level, which basically makes it even more complicated for the disability movement to really influence policy making and resource allocation. And will require from international cooperation actors some kind of rethinking. How do we support at those different levels? And because we cannot make the assumption, working mostly at community level, you never reach the scale and the level of resource allocation from government that are required to implement the CRPD in any given sector. And working only at the national level, you will never reach the level of implementation that you are supposed to reach, because there will be no demand side at the community level. So I would say those are really very important elements. I don't have the silver bullet on how to address that, but there is definitely, I believe, if we think of DPOs, you were mentioning CBM, there are other organizations in IDDC and other NGOs that have a key role to play in supporting the disability movement at those different levels, indeed. If there is any other comments?
Thank you, Alex. Indeed, we don't have time anymore, so I just ask you if you can reply to the few questions we have in the chat box and maybe go to conclusions.
So there are many of them actually. So
yes, there are a lot of questions. Sorry, there are a lot of questions, I know, but we don't have time to reply to everybody. So I suggest that maybe we can reply after. We can put together all the questions in the chat box. So I invite also people that raise their hands to write their questions, and we will reply to you in the upcoming days. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for that.
Yeah. So building on some of the comments that have been made, and the first thing I would say is this connection between open civic space and DPO participation. If you look at European Union countries, which most of them have a fairly open, most of them, not all of them, fairly open civic space, it doesn't imply that there is strong involvement or engagement of DPOs, organization of persons with disabilities. Actually, we can see in some sub-Saharan Africa a much higher level of involvement and engagement of organization of people with disabilities, much more dynamic movement than in some European countries. There is a lot of different reasons for that. In some countries, you will have, for instance, service providers that have a very strong voice and weight, and persons with disabilities and their organizations sometimes are more in a consumer and user of service rather than more in terms of activist type of engagement. Some governments think that job is down because they already spend 1.5% of the GDP on disability, so what else can I do? and they might not put the energy in engagement as it's necessary. And at the opposite, you would have government that may have closer civic space and less resources, that will have actually more and qualitative engagement and more intensive engagement because it's the priority for the wife of the president, like is the case in few countries I know. And yeah, disability, inclusive education is the top priority. We need to do something, and then it creates this whole space while other civil society organizations are shut down and do not are allowed to thrive. However, in countries where you have severe restriction on the functioning of NGOs, for instance, access to international funds, etc., it will have an impact on organization of people with disabilities like any others, and it will restrict tremendously their abilities. Again, countries where there is very low level of access to information and low level of transparency, you might have some type of participation, but you will never reach meaningful participation, nor basic participation, because DPOs will never have the tools that they require to reach these thresholds of being meaningful counterpart to government. But I would say we're working through this study and looking at the results of the global survey from IDA. I think we are really going in the right direction. There is really a momentum. Probably one of the challenges we identified is everything I said about data and evidence, and how do you transform those in arguments, and how do you use that to build consensus and collective voice among the disability movement, and how do you use that as a platform with government. There is a challenge here where other movements that may face stronger resistance, like the gender movement, for instance, in many ways they are better in this type of work, and we believe that this is probably one of the easiest investments that can be done by international cooperation that could have the greatest impact, together with supporting DPOs and investing in the training of government officials and investing in consultation space. But really happy to follow through with those of you who are interested, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much, Alex. Really interesting, this presentation. Time flies really when we talk about, every time we talk about this study indeed. So I'm sorry for the ones we didn't reply, and but as I said here, we will try to do it through in the next days. So well, thank you again, Alex. Thank you to your collaborator for this study, so Janina Artsenjeva and Magdalena Orlando, the other two experts in charge for the reports in Africa and South America. And thank you to the audience, to participants. You will receive in the upcoming days the follow-up email with the recording of the session, with the presentation, even if you could download now on your handouts, but you will receive the presentation by mail with the recording, and even with the link of the study. However, you find it on immediately on our website. It's already published. So thank you very much again, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much.